Hi, my name is Alex, and my topic is Nazi racial theories and how the Nazis use these ideologies to justify the mass killings of over 6 million people. My thesis is that the Nazi regime did not persecute and murder 6 million people strictly based on their opinions or their appearance or their behavior, but also on the racial theories they studied and how they found themselves racially and genetically superior. My first point is how the theories of social Darwinism factored into Nazi concepts of supremacy. Pretty much evolutionary theory and Nazi policy went hand in hand. Darwin's most popular theory is survival of the fittest, meaning that those who are most adapted to society will survive, whereas those who are not will eventually die off. The Nazis took this theory and manipulated it and concluded that only the fittest if only the fittest in society survive, then there will eventually be a mass death of the unfit. And this will eventually lead to evolutionary progress and allow nature to take its course towards balance. And the Nazis used this theory to their advantage. For my next point, the Nazis incorporated the concept of eugenics into their worldview. Eugenics is basically a modification or the improvement of the genetic quality of a specific group of people or some type of race. In other words, the Nazis wanted to preserve the positive eugenics, meaning the good hereditary characteristics, and destroy the negative eugenics, or those eugenics that belong to the disfavored or the weak groups of society. Basically, the Nazis found themselves, in their perspective, to have positive eugenics, no negative eugenics, whereas people such as Jewish people or gypsies, homosexuals, handicapped, or communists even had negative eugenics. Furthermore, hereditary characteristics laid the groundwork for the Nazi explanation of how great the Aryan race was and how pure they were throughout the entire world. For example, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, but Erich Ehrenreich, he wrote a book about Nazi ancestral proof, and he further elaborates on the idea of eugenics and concluded that from the Nazi perspective, science came from concerns of social instability, and that science was a partial solution for growing problems within a nation. And but by far the biggest concern the Nazi regime felt they had to prevent was the mixing of incompatible races, because this further leads to the damage of the almighty Aryan race. And to do this, they incorporated what they called the Nuremberg laws. These laws were basically restrictions on what the inferior races were prohibited, and they included marriage to an Aryan, or sexual activity, or reproduction. In addition to Darwin's theories and eugenics, Nazi theorists clung to the idea of ancestral proof. Theorists such as Alfred Rosenberg mastered the idea that hereditary traits were the most important factor determining one's behavior and character. Alfred Rosenberg was a leading Nazi theorist, by the way. He further proved that the persecution of the Jews was because of the actions put forth by their ancestors. For example, he concluded that the Jewish race had this unchanging, despicable hereditary character. And in addition, he linked his ideals to how Jewish ancestry was to blame for moral decline of the nation, and how clashes of blood within history leads to the decline of nations, further speculating that the future of Germany, or the future of the world, depended on the elimination of the inferior. One example I read about was how in Hitler's Mein Kampf he would talk about how World War One was, how it led to a huge decline in Germany with the economy, with social unrest, and instead of blaming war tactics or anything like that, they blamed it on how races that were incompatible were to blame for this, because they would ultimately lead to the demise of the world or a nation. Lastly, with regards to Hitler, his views centered on the Aryan race as a whole. For example, he would say that, that Aryans were the highest image of God, and how if the Jewish question goes unsolved, it will lead to the doom of the world. For example, in his book Mein Kampf, he trusted the notion of social inequality, meaning he embraced it. And he stressed the idea of inequality because the struggle for existence between races justified the annihilation of inferior races. So if you have that distinction between who is inferior and who is superior, it is easier to just cast off those that are inferior. Like I said, those who were inferior would be wiped off due to evolutionary advancement, going back to Darwin's theories. And every theory of Hitler's that he would take from Darwin, he would just elaborate on how, even though we are casting these people off, the ends justify the means. He even quoted death to the parasite after the destruction of the victim. All in all, Hitler, along with his disciples, continued to cherish racial eugenic thought to where it allowed them to sanction, encourage, and implement the extermination of not every non-Aryan on the face of the earth. So, that's it. That's my presentation.